Imagine a budding Victorian-era naturalist who, after an epic voyage around the world, comes up with a big idea that he thought would decisively settle one of the great issues of the day. It would provide a comprehensive, naturalistic explanation of the origin of the varieties of life on Earth. But imagine still that after committing several discursive versions of it to paper, the last a 200-plus page treatise full of evidence and argument, this ambitious gentleman scholar shelves it to work on other topics. And despite a strong proprietary attachment to his big idea as a revolutionary theory, an opinion that we would all later share, he does not place it in the public domain for nearly 20 years. As we know, this was not some scenario concocted in a creative writing workshop. It was exactly what mid-20th century historians of science, the progenitors of today's Darwin industry, were faced with when they turned their attention to the history of Darwin's big ideas. Darwin scholars then latched on to the key evidential elements of the story, the private notebooks that showed the development of his theorizing in the late 1830s, and the successive unpublished versions of it that were transcribed in the early 1840s, well before he finally went public in 1858. It was an intriguing facet of Darwin's career. A succession of scholars discerned what they perceived as a hesitation to publish. The question then became, what stopped the reluctant Mr. Darwin? A range of answers were proffered, some quite conservative and plausible, others more fanciful and elaborate. However, the delay's status as an accepted verity coloured almost every portrait of the man from the 1950s onwards. The Beagle arrived back in England on the 2nd of October 1836. Darwin immediately reunited with his family and gets his land legs back. He's now completely forgotten about entering the clergy and attempts to establish himself as a scientist. He goes out and about London where he has lodgings, forging connections around him. Fortuitously, he meets Charles Lyell, the principal geologist of his day. Lyell has already been impressed by Darwin's work and is anxious to help him get along. He sees in Darwin a possible ally for his uniformitarian geology and introduces Darwin to the Geological Society, where Darwin rapidly climbs up the rungs to become secretary. And all the while he's thinking about what he has seen, trying to piece it together. At some point since leaving Australia in the early part of 1836, he has become converted to transmutation, but of course he has told nobody. Instead, in mid-July 1837, he opens a new secret notebook, Notebook B, which he entitles Zunamia. In this notebook, he'll start jotting down his ideas, attempting to develop them, attempting to build upon his Malthusian view of the kingdom of nature. Soon, Notebook B turns into Notebook C, which turns into Notebook D, his ideas evolving about natural selection and about the notion of common descent. At 28 years old, Darwin is still a relatively young man, and he's a bachelor, and quite clearly marriage is on his mind. He decides that the woman for him is his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, and she accepts his proposal with alacrity, and they're married on the 29th of January 1839. Emma is a devout woman, a Unitarian by background. Darwin immediately makes her aware of his own doubts and his beliefs about the universe. He doesn't want anything to be between them. In fact, Emma may have been the first person that he told about his heretical scientific views. And whatever her concerns about the gulf in their beliefs and her worries that in the afterlife they may not meet again, Emma remains a resolute supporter of Darwin, standing by his side, bringing up his family, helping to edit his works. In 1842, Darwin's growing family moved from the city to Down House in Kent. It is a rural retreat some 15 miles from the city, a place where the Darwins can get away from the stresses and strains of urban life, a place where Darwin can think in peace. Increasingly, he will stay put at Down, inviting fellow scientists to visit him for weekends, writing to his vast network of correspondence, carrying out day to day his writing and his experiments and his thinking, but as far as possible not travelling anywhere unless it involved his health. Much of his time is spent trying to sort out the remainder of the Beagle collections, but he's also constantly thinking about his theory of transmutation. In 1842, he commits to paper a 30-page essay sketching out natural selection and common descent. Soon after, Darwin would renew his relationship with Joseph Dalton Hooker, who he had met just before Hooker had gone off on Ross's Antarctic expedition as a ship's surgeon. On renewing their acquaintance, they formed a really close bond, and it would be to Hooker that Darwin would make his confession of 1844 that he was working on transmutation and that it seemed like committing a murder. Some months after this confession, Darwin would complete a 230-page essay. Theoretically, it has come on in leaps and bounds. In fact, the major elements of what would be published in Origin were already in place. He even paid the local schoolmaster to copy it out and then sealed it in an envelope, telling his wife Emma that if he should die, that it should be sent off to an editor who would treat it sympathetically and published. As Janet Brown acerbically comments, there could only be one reason for this. He would rather be dead than to have his theory go public. A few months later, in October 1844, transmutation takes centre stage with the anonymous publication of Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. Vestiges portrayed an enormously old universe. It also put the idea forward that transmutation was at the heart of speciation. The mechanism it proposed was distinctly Lamarckian, and yet there was a respectability to it, as Mr. Vestiges, as the anonymous writer was known at the time, also put forward the idea that a god had drawn up the rules for the universe. It causes a veritable sensation. Everybody who is anybody is reading it, even Queen Victoria and her husband Prince Albert. Many of the reviews in the popular journals were ecstatic. It seemed to be the very epitome of progress. At first, Darwin was myth, while most of the people around him were deeply amused by it. Hooker, in particular, enjoyed poking fun at Darwin over the matter of vestiges. But for Darwin, it seemed as if someone had trespassed on his very own territory. But annoyance would rapidly turn to terror when Darwin read and was deeply shocked by the ferocity of Adam Sedgwick's review in the Edinburgh Review for July 1845. Sedgwick was Professor of Geology at Cambridge and had also been something of a mentor to the young Charles Darwin when he was studying at Cambridge. They'd even been on a field trip to Snowdonia, where Sedgwick had taught him the elements of practical geology. As Darwin said in one of his letters, I read it with fear and trembling. And then there were the barnacles. Some months after, Hooker tartly commented in a letter on Gerard's work on species. I'm not inclined, he said, to take much for granted from anyone who treats the subject in his way and who does not know what it is to be a naturalist himself. Darwin, oversensitive about his right to talk about species, particularly when he compared himself to Hooker, took this as a criticism. He read into it that he himself did not have a right to talk about species unless he had undertaken his own incredibly detailed study. Defensively, Darwin replied, How painfully to me true is your remark that no one has hardly a right to examine the question of species who has not minutely described many. By autumn 1846, Darwin had finally finished describing the beagle specimens, apart from one single barnacle species. As Desmond and Moore have it, he anticipated a short descriptive paper. It would not take long. He had one species to describe after all, even if it was bizarre. Some months, he optimistically reckoned, a year at most. The species he chose was a bizarre burrowing barnacle parasite-like called Anthrobalanus. He started borrowing other barnacles to make comparisons and then started considering other groups. At some point on this trajectory, he decided to do the whole damn lot, the Cirripedia in totem. It was smelly, finicky, painstaking work, and the years rolled by. Darwin beavering away, often exhausted, over his microscope with his dissecting tools at hand in his study. Over the course of the 1840s, Darwin's health had been progressively deteriorating. It was stomach troubles, and it became more and more debilitating. Nothing helped him. Orthodox medicine seemed to draw a blank. Eventually, he's persuaded by some friends that he should try the cold water cure, and he resorts to this form of treatment called hydropathy, travelling to Malvern to put himself under the care of James Manby Gully. Gully was one of the foremost hydropathists of his day, author of many books that have been widely read by people like Charles Dickens. There was something of the society doctor about him, and certainly Darwin took to him immediately. The whole Darwin tribe, Emma, the children, the nannies, decamped to Malvern while Darwin underwent the water cure. After some months of the regime, which included plentiful supplies of clean water, constant bathing, walking, and eating healthy food, Darwin was feeling considerably better. And so he returned once again to the exhausting work of his barnacles. Task had almost become obsessive. One of his younger children was heard asking a friend where his father did his barnacles. Darwin may have still been thinking about his work on transmutation, but he had shelved the research beyond what he was doing with the Cirripedia. And then, in 1851, after a very long illness, his beloved daughter Annie died. Her death took place under Gully's care, although she had gone to Malvern when she was extremely sick. Both Charles and Emma were devastated by their loss. Charles would continue sporadically with hydropathy, but he would never return to Malvern. But he did return to the barnacles. In 1853, the first volume of his work on Cirripedia came out, and then by autumn he was nearly done. The first volume itself won him the Royal Medal from the Royal Society, which he received in November 1853. In the end, a month had turned into a year, and a year into almost 8, but he was done. Had this finally earned him his license to speak on species? He returned to the species work with alacrity, building his networks, collecting evidence from his correspondence, persuading, cajoling, sometimes begging for the information he needed to confirm his theory. One of these correspondents that he used was Alfred Russel Wallace, who had been travelling and collecting and travelling, and by the early 1850s was in Asia, in the Dutch East Indies, getting specimens to sell to finance his scientific endeavours. In late 1855, the not terribly prestigious Annals and Magazine of Natural History published one of the essays that Wallace had written. This was to become known as the Sarawak Law Paper. Here he noted the close proximity between extinct species and very similar existing species. Charles Lyell, on reading the paper and knowing that Darwin was working on transmutation, warned him that someone was getting perilously close to his territory. Lyell could read between the lines. Darwin could not or would not. Deceived by Wallace's vague references to a creator, Darwin pushed it aside as another effort from the Paleite school. All thoughts of Wallace were put away as Darwin commenced working on his monumental natural selection. This was to be Darwin's great book that would overwhelm all opposition with the magnitude of the evidence. Certainly in 1856, when he commenced writing it, he was considering the possibility of going public. How many years it would have taken Darwin to write, nobody knows. Fate intervened when, on the 18th of June 1858, a package was delivered to Down House. In it was a paper from Wallace, with a letter asking Darwin if he might show Lyell the contents and perhaps get it published. On the face of it, the paper appeared to outline the self-same theory that Darwin had spent the best part of the last 20 years developing, the transmutation of species through a very similar mechanism to natural selection. Things were hard enough as it were. Charles's infant son was dying, and now this. All my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed, he wailed. Grief-struck, he left the matter in the hands of Lyell and Hooker, who brokered the solution of a joint paper with evidence to demonstrate Darwin's priority, a letter to Asa Gray in 1857, extracts from the 1844 essay. This was read on the 1st of July 1858 at the Linnean Society on a hot and sleepy afternoon, and no one seemed to notice. Wallace's blessing wouldn't arrive until January 1859, by which time Darwin was heavily into the task of reducing his incomplete 150,000 word manuscript Natural Selection into a shorter book, which would be published in November 1859 as Origin. Darwin was quite clearly concerned about his priority. We can see that when that parcel arrived from Wallace that took him so much by surprise. In the end, there was nothing more that he wanted than to be known as the person who discovered evolution through natural selection. However, we're left wondering why it took him so long to go public, and what would have happened if that package hadn't arrived. How long would it have taken him? And what exactly was it that was stopping him from telling people about natural selection? For as we'll see, Darwin was open with a number of people about the fact that he believed in transmutation, but those he told about natural selection were few and far between. In the next module, what I want to look at is the state of society during the period when Darwin was thinking out his ideas.